So an alternate approach that is used, and is actually quite widely used now by athletes, which is a form of, inverted commas, cryostimulation, is using just cold water immersion. So ice bathing as an example, as you see here in this image. And the theory here is very similar, right? It's not surprising that the theory is similar. They're both using cold exposure. But what's the theory? Well, it's suggested to promote recovery. Why? Reducing muscle edema, as we saw with the cryotherapy. The presence of edema, as we already applied, impedes oxygen delivery, because what you get is that compression of the capillaries. It increases the transit distance between the capillaries and the muscle fibers for O2 exchange, because you get that compression. So edema is something we want to reduce. If we can decrease the transit distance between the capillary and the muscle fiber, we fundamentally increase or speed up the recovery process. So the theory of cold water immersion, a little bit like cryotherapy, is it reduces the edema by decreasing incoming blood flow and therefore facilitating the clearance of peripheral fluid. Okay, so the effects are collectively mediated through cold-induced vasoconstriction, but the difference here that isn't really thought about with cryotherapy is through hydrostatic pressures. And these lead to an increase in central blood volume. So that's a real distinction. When we were talking about cryotherapy, we absolutely talked about vasoconstriction. We alluded to it being a bit like blood flow restriction. But the difference here is, yes, you get that vasoconstriction and the benefits of the vasoconstriction in terms of reducing the edema. Okay, so that's really important. But it's also this pressure-based response. So this schematic, actually from this group, from which the reference is provided, it's a fairly recent paper as well, 2016, shows us the kind of processes, all of which can lead to recovery from cold water immersion. And so we can see here that we've got our vasoconstriction-based response. We can see the effect that it has on limb blood flow, so we get a reduction in blood flow. So we get a reduction in limb blood flow, which we've already talked about. That reduces edema, and that therefore enhances muscle O2 delivery, which is quite neat in its own outcome. But that, as we saw with the cryotherapy, decreases delayed onset muscle soreness, and as we saw with the cryotherapy, we get an increase in the analgesic effect because of the cold exposure, which also contributes to delayed onset muscle soreness. But also, we get this reduction in muscle temperature, decreases metabolism, decreases inflammation, and that therefore has this direct effect on the recovery process that we see here. But the one that we're going to focus on as well is this pressure-based response. Because you're exposing somebody in the water environment, you get a hydrostatic pressure. That leads to a hemodilution. We change or increase osmotic gradients, and we get kind of, in inverted commas, debris or waste product clearance. So let's think about that. Well, the post-exercise cold water immersion, as we've alluded to, it has been suggested it will look at the data to accelerate the removal of muscle metabolites. Therefore, you improve metabolic recovery, particularly from intense exercise bouts. But you see this being used a lot by athletes and non-athletes alike, following all sorts of kind of interventions. So what is going on? Well, the transportation of the metabolites from the muscle into the central circulation is then facilitated by hydrostatic pressure as well as arterial and cutaneous vasoconstriction. And so what you get is it leads, we are reducing, remember you've got a central blood flow. Because you're reducing blood flow to the muscle, it's automatically directing blood flow to the core. It's taking anything from the muscle away. Remember that the circulation is the primary way in which we move heat. So what's starting to happen is, it sounds kind of counterintuitive, is that by reducing the blood flow, getting the vasoconstriction, and you get that pressure effect, it increases the rate of movement of the metabolites from the muscle, away from the muscle into the kind of the central circulation. And that's where we want them. And that then we can then in essence, get kind of clearance. And so what we get is what's referred to as intracellular, intravascular osmotic gradient. And so that leads to the release, the efflux of these intracellular constituents, metabolic byproducts from the intracellular and the interstitial spaces into the peripheral circulation. And that's the really important part. It's by exposing somebody to the cold, this hydrostatic pressure combined with the reduction in blood flow coming into the cell because of the vasoconstriction leads to this osmotic gradient. And so you get metabolites now being directed out from the cell into the peripheral circulation and then being directed away from the cell into the central circulation. Well, if we then think about that a little bit further, the reason cold water immersion would seem to work is not only are we talking about these kind of osmotic pressure gradients, but it's also, not surprisingly, reducing body temperature. Well, what we know is the thermal conductivity of water is about 25 times greater compared to that of air. Now that's really important because that then enhances what we call the capacity for heat storage. And that means that it allows for greater energy expenditure before physiological limitations in core body temperature are attained. So one of the things that's often referred to is exposing somebody, putting somebody in cold water prior to exercise, because it increases the heat storage capacity. You might want to think about that, is that beneficial post-exercise? What we also have is that it's cold water immersion actually, as we saw with the cryotherapy, has some evidence to say it might ameliorate central nervous system fatigue by enhancing cerebral perfusion and oxygenation. And it's been shown to be depressed during exercise-induced hypothermia and implicated in the development of central nervous fatigue. And there's certainly good evidence for this, particularly, this is one of the advantages, is that the head is not exposed like the rest of the body is in cold water immersion. That's, a big difference to what you get in cryotherapy. So what we have then is if you restore cerebral perfusion and then presumably oxygenation is increased, you get that through increases in mean arterial pressures and cardiac output because you've got an increase in central blood volume following the water immersion. So this is kind of, I've done the water immersion, I take somebody out, I suddenly get the increase in the cardiac output. It's understanding that kind of balance between exposing somebody to the condition and then the response that occurs after the exposure. So here we've got kind of two approaches, again, which were alluded to a little bit in the larger schematic that we showed a moment ago. And so what you've got here is you've got metabolite accumulation, which is in panel A, and you've got CNS recovery in panel B. All right, so in panel A, you can see here we've got the vasoconstriction, talked about the limb blood flow, obviously a decrease in skin blood flow because you're now trying to reduce heat loss. So that increases central blood volume because you're moving it away from the periphery. And that then increases what we call metabolite efflux. Combined with the hydrostatic pressures at the same time that we've talked about, you get the hemodilution, that osmotic gradient, and again, that it will all appear or supposed to enhance this recovery process. In terms of central nervous fatigue, it's a little bit more complicated, but it seems to be linked partly to the serotonin-dopamine ratio. You reduce this, and that's quite important. Serotonin is also known as 5 5-hydroxytryptophan, and it's linked to the notion of sleep and tiredness. So what the evidence is you reduce the core temperature, it reduces the serotonin to the dopamine ratio. That then reduces your perception of effort, your tiredness sensation, and that's linked to a reduction in the alpha and beta motor neuron firing patterns, which is then associated with the reduction in central nervous system fatigue. This is all here about central nervous fatigue. You've also increased the heat storage capacity. And you think, well, how does that work? Well, fundamentally, if I reduce the core temperature, I've got a greater range over which I can theoretically store heat. If I have a greater range over which I can store heat, that reduces fatigue and also reduces my sensation or sensations to the notion of fatigue. So are there negatives with this? Because it all sounds quite positive, perhaps sounds more positive than we saw with cryostimulation. Well, not surprisingly, if you get cooling, you actually get prolonged decrements in muscle temperature. And so one of the things that's been reported is that actually that reduces the process of glycogen synthesis. And fundamentally, a vast majority of what we do in terms of exercise and performance is dependent upon the availability of muscle glycogen. Coupled with that, if you expose somebody to cold temperatures, it's highly conceivable that you're going to increase low-level muscle contractions through the process of shivering. And so if you get that, you're starting to burn energy. Shivering costs, they are muscle contractions. And so what the theory is that not only does it seem to decrease potentially decrease the rate of muscle glycogen resynthesis, but particularly if the exposure is too long or the temperature is too low, you actually start to get shivering, you start to get these muscle contractions taking place, you start to burn energy that you're meant to be recovering. So, not surprisingly, you're causing vasoconstriction, and that reduces muscle blood flow. Well, if I reduce muscle blood flow, everything that's been purported seems to be positive because you get this kind of positive osmotic gradient, but it reduces oxygen availability, and it also reduces the delivery of other kind of nutrients. And so the other theory is if the exposure is too long and too cold, you reduce these to a degree where you actually trigger the process of anaerobic substrate metabolism, and that therefore also potentially becomes detrimental to the process of recovery. So it's very much a fine balance between getting the potential positive benefits and these potential negative benefits or negative consequences. So, does it work? Well, again, let's use our effect sizes to tell us about this intervention. So here we've got data, and this is for delayed onset muscle soreness, and we've got the immediate effect here. So this is the average immediate effect for the whole group. So if we look at the kind of the overall immediate effect, it would seem to favour cold water immersion, and actually we're getting quite a large effect. It's getting pretty close for immediately. 24 hours post, it seems to be less effective, but it seems to give us an overall medium effect here of around about 0.34. So it's considered to be small for DOMs. It's considered to be borderline medium for DOMs immediately post-exercise, and the overall effect is in the region of about 0.5. So it's a small to borderline medium effect. So again, does that mean it's not worth using? It's not suggesting that. It's just saying that actually its benefits are not significantly, they're not great in terms of the magnitude of them. If we then look at this is for lactate. We've got immediately 24 hours and 48 hours. The 48 hours one I think we can take with a little bit more of a pinch of salt because there's only a couple of studies included here. But 48 hours post, they reckon there's about a 0.82 effect. That's a large effect. A 0.61 is a medium effect, and 0.05 there is actually, it seems to be, doesn't seem to be any favour at all. In fact, immediate effect is there is no benefit on lactate clearance. And that's almost certainly because of the vasoconstrictory effect that we were alluding to previously as a negative effect. So the overall effect size across these conditions is actually in the region of about 0.3 to 0.4. Again, only small. So it's probably not very meaningful, as we saw with the cryotherapy, in terms of lactate clearance.